How did we get to the week of the 4th of July? It's flying by, isn't it? Today, we're going to prepare to launch into a new series. And the new series kicks off next Sunday. But today, I wanted to take just a few minutes and kind of kick around the idea of why. Why do a question series? Why are we going to begin to grapple with some of the questions that you might have? And I say we, I'm talking about us here at Blue Mountain, and I'm also talking about out at Skyrocket. Pastor Brian is going to be grappling with some of the questions that are coming in too. So why do a question series? Can't you just Google your questions and find out the answers? I mean, why do it here at church? And the reality is you can Google anything. And you can find all kinds of answers, and if you don't like the answers that you find, you can find the answers that you want to find. I mean, and that's what we do oftentimes. We go looking for information, and there's a lot of information, and then there's some disinformation, and then there's bad information, and it's all out there. So what are we going to do? We're going to open the Bible over the next several weeks and look for answers to some of your faith questions. Sometimes we ask questions that really don't need to be answered. Some of the questions that we have they're just minor questions, but there are some questions that we have that are huge, that stop our ability to move forward in our faith and cause us to come up against that obstacle and stop us cold. So, first of all, last Sunday, Leslie shared up here on the platform, and she always does a great job. Thank you, Leslie, for sharing last week. Yeah. And so while she was sharing, 3 of us men were out on our motorcycles in Northern California, making our way home on Sunday. And as we did, we were out there riding the backcountry discovery route. And what that means is these are roads that you probably aren't going to take your Subaru Outback down. You know, they're pretty rough, and there's washouts, and there's water bars, and there's rocks, and some of the rocks are loose, and some of the rocks are kind of in hard ground, and there's sand, sometimes lots of sand. So we started off in Mammoth, California, at a high place. It was 9,265 feet, and we started our way down on this trail, and it was an ATV trail, all-terrain vehicle trail. And those ATVs tear things up, and so it was all churned up, and the dirt was really loose as we started making our way. We've got heavy bikes, and we've got all this camping gear, and it's all on top of our bikes, and we're making our way down the mountain on our bikes. And it started off, and there was a dusting of sand, and pretty soon there's a 1/4 inch of sand, and pretty soon after that it's an inch, and then it's 2 inches, and then it's like 3-4 inches, and then it's over your head. Not quite, but it felt like it. I mean, it was deep sand in certain parts, and we're descending down, and I came to the realization pretty quickly that there's no way back. There's no way back. There's forward, and that's the only way out at this point, is to keep going down the hill, because to try to go back up was impossible. And so it is in our lives. We move forward, and as we move forward, we run into obstacles, and we run into tough things along the way. And sometimes we wish we could just go back, right? We wish we could make our way back up the path, but there is no way back up the path. The only way through it is through it. But there are times, as people of faith, there are times that we come to an obstacle that we can't figure out how to get through. We come to an obstacle in our faith that there doesn't seem to be a way through it, or you can't really get around it. You can't go under it. You can't go over it. And so what are you going to do? And we oftentimes come up against questions like that. It's those kind of questions that can cause us to move in our faith right up to that point, and that's all the further we're going to go. We can't go further. That question stops us from progressing in our faith. And so it is that we're going to try to unpack some of those kinds of questions on our faith today, or not today, but as we go into this series. So What do those questions look like? Sometimes those questions can be a diagnosis. Sometimes those questions can be a loss, a disappointment. Sometimes those questions can just seem like an impassable situation, a crisis, and it comes to a halt. And then we set up camp, and we pitch our tents, and that is where our faith will live from now on, because we can't get through that question. But if we're followers of Jesus, we have to find a way to continue to follow, because he keeps on marching. And we can trust him with our questions. We can trust him with those things that seem to stop us. Now, maybe we're afraid to ask certain questions because we're afraid to ask that question because it feels like that might be the thread that holds it all together. And if I ask that question, it can tug at that thread, and pretty soon my entire faith system comes unraveled and there's nothing left but a pile of thread, right? And it can feel that way. Some of the questions that we ask are frightening like that. We're afraid that if we knew the answer to that question, we wouldn't be able to keep the faith that we have. I've told you the story about my father, and I'll get to our passage in just a moment. We're going to be in the book of 1 Samuel today, chapter 3. But I told you that about my father's father rejected him. And my father's father probably suspected that he was not the father of my father. Did you follow me? Yeah, and so here's what it was. My dad's father accepted his older brother as his, and accepted his younger sister as his, but he rejected my father. And this has bothered my dad all his life. My dad's 83 now. It's bothered him all of his life. And even to this very day, the last time I was home, he mentioned this. And there's nobody left who knows the answer to that question. Who was really his father? Everybody's gone. Even his older brother is now gone. And so there's no answer, but there is a way to know. One time, one of my siblings got my dad a 23andMe. It's that DNA test, where you spit in a tube and you send it away and you get your DNA. He did it just to see, who he was and what his ethnic makeup, all that kind of stuff. And so he did that. And it turns out his younger sister also did the 23andMe. She spit in the tube and sent it away. And I said, Dad, all you got to do is compare your results with her results, and you would know without a question the answer to your question. But he said, no, I don't think I want to do that. Sometimes we're afraid of the answers, right? Sometimes there's a question that is so big that we're afraid of the answers, and especially when we come to questions of faith. And so we come to one question that I want us to wrestle with today, and it's a question that Eli, the priest of the Lord, asked. In Samuel chapter 3, Hannah had given birth to a son. She was unable to have a child. She went to the Lord and asked God to allow her to have a son. She had a son, and she gave him to the Lord for all of the days of his life. And when he was old enough and he was weaned, she took him to the priest Eli and left him at the temple for Eli to raise. She said, he will be the Lord's. And so the priest Eli raised Samuel, and he lived there in the tabernacle with the Ark of the Covenant right there. And he was to serve the Lord all of his days. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli. Now in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. Stop there just a second. That is the way it works, right? There are times that it seems like God is close and we can hear God speaking, or we can sense what God might be saying to us. There are times in our lives where we know the voice of God somehow is at work, and we can sense God's direction. And then there are times in our lives when it feels like I haven't heard from God in a long time. God is far away. I haven't heard his whisper. I haven't heard his leading. I just have not heard from God. Now, the people were also, the entire nation of Israel was going through one of those dry spells. It seemed like God hadn't spoken in a very long time now. Verse 2, one night Eli, he's the priest, one night Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed. Interesting that they would give us, that the author would give us that little notation, that Eli, who was almost blind. Why did he tell us that? Why did he include that little detail? He's almost blind. Was it physical blindness? Yes, it was probably physical blindness. We know that he's 98 years old. And so he's 98 years old, he's physically blind, but probably there was also a spiritual blindness taking place in Eli's life as well, or a deafness to what God had been saying to Eli. So Eli hasn't seen God at work and hasn't heard from God in a very long time. Verse 3, the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. Suddenly the Lord called out, Samuel. Yes, Samuel replied, what is it? He got up and ran to Eli. Here I am, did you call me? I didn't call you, Eli replied. Go back to bed. So he did. Have you ever wakened up in the middle of the night to a noise? You heard that? A voice calling out, or just a noise. You've had that experience, and your mind is trying to figure out what's going on. I don't know what's happening. This happened to us on this trip. So there were 3 of us, and we had 3 different tents. And each night, I had gone to sleep to the soothing sound of Tim snoring just a little, the regular rhythm of a nice soft snore, and Corey flopping up and down on his mat. Could hear it. I mean, that was the nice sounds of slumber. Here we are, we're at Lake Tahoe in California. And then, sometime in the night, I hear somebody yell, hey, bear! Hey, bear! Hey, bear! You hear what I'm saying? I'm saying, hey, bear. And they're yelling, hey, bear! And then I hear a car horn, beep, beep, beep. Somebody's beeping a car horn. And then I hear a pot and a pan going clang, 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 clang. Someone's banging on a pot and a pan. And then I hear a dog start to bark. Something is going on out there. A bear had come into somebody's camp. And it woke me up, and I'm like, what is happening? And then I figured out, okay, there's a bear over there. It's not over here. That's good. But I'll tell you what, I lay awake almost all night thinking, well, maybe it's not over there now, but I bet it's coming our way. Right? So this voice calls to Samuel and wakes him up, and he runs to Eli. I didn't call you, Eli replied. Go back to bed. And so he did. Verse 6, then the Lord called out again, Samuel. And again, Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, my son, Eli said. Go back to bed. Verse 7 tells us, Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never had a message from the Lord before. Stop there just a second. God calls to us, to all humanity. God calls to people. And a lot of times, people don't recognize that this is the voice of the Lord speaking to me. This is God's leading. This is God speaking somewhere deep in my soul, deep in my knower, where God talks to us. They don't know that it's God that's calling to them because they had never had a message from God before. And so it is, he hears this voice, then, here I am, did you call me? Then Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy because Eli had had this experience. Eli knew the voice of God. Eli had received calls before from God. So he said to Samuel, go lie down again. If someone calls again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went back to bed. And the Lord came and called as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel replied, speak, your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, I am about to do a shocking thing in Israel. I'm going to carry out all my threats against Eli and his family from beginning to end. I have warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever because his sons are blaspheming God, and he hasn't disciplined them. So I have vowed that the sins of Eli and his sons will never be forgiven by sacrifices or offerings. These are the priests of God. I have vowed that these priestly ways will never work for them. They will never receive forgiveness by using sacrifices and offerings. Why did God tell this to a child? I mean, what is Samuel going to do? What could he do about any of it? He has no power. He has no authority. He is not the priest. He's just a servant. But God was going to speak over and over. And as he spoke, it would go through Samuel. And Samuel would just relay what God was saying to the people. Now, some backstory. Eli has two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Who would name their kids that name? I don't know. Any Phinehas's here? And so he has these two sons, but these two sons had sinned by committing blasphemy against God. In fact, in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, we discover in verse 12, it says, Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels who had no respect for the Lord. They're scoundrels. What had they done? Well, they had helped themselves to the offering at the tabernacle. People came with sacrifices to lay on the offering to burn for God. And because they were priests, they had a right to a portion of that sacrifice because that's how they ate. But instead of waiting for the sacrifice to take place, they said, actually, I think I could use that prime rib right there. And they would chop off the best piece of the meat for themselves and just take it. But it was supposed to be offered first. It was supposed to be boiled, and then they could take a piece. But they just chose. And then if somebody said, no, that's not the way you're supposed to do it, they would say, we're going to take it from you. And they threatened them. And so, in that way, they treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. Not only that, they used their power and their position as priests to seduce the young women who worked at the entrance of the tabernacle. It was awful what they were doing. And Eli saw it. And Eli went to them and said, my sons, you should not do this. And he called them out on it. But he didn't stop them. He just said, stop doing it. But he didn't stop them himself. Okay, verse 15 of 1 Samuel 13, verse 15. Samuel stayed in bed until morning and then got up and opened the doors of the tabernacle as usual. He was afraid to tell Eli what the Lord had said to him. But Eli called out to him, Samuel, my son. Here I am, Samuel replied. And then came the question, verse 17. What did the Lord say to you? That's the question. What's the message from the Lord? What did God say to you, Samuel? God woke you in the night. What did the Lord say to you? Tell me everything, and may God strike you and even kill you if you're hiding anything from me. He threatens his life. So Samuel told Eli everything. He didn't hold anything back. It is the Lord's will, Eli replied. Let him do what he thinks is best. Samuel's question, what did God say? And tell me everything, or may God strike you dead. He's threatening. And so Samuel's like, hey, here's what he said. And he just told him, here's what the message is from God, that you and your sons, God is going to carry out his threats that he's made against you. And Eli, you would think in that moment he would confess his sin right on the spot. You think, and in a way, I guess he kind of does. He said, it's the Lord's will. But you would think he would tear his robes and he'd put ashes on his head like like the Jews did whenever God would call them into account. They would turn to him with all their heart, and they would tear their robes and put ashes on their heads, and they would beg for forgiveness. And oftentimes, when a prophet came and pronounced judgment against people, they did that very thing. And sometimes God relented. But he didn't do that very thing. Eli didn't confess his sins in that moment. But Eli had heard the voice of God before. Speak. He told Eli, tell this voice when he calls you, speak, your servant is listening. But it had been a long time since he'd heard God's voice or seen God at work. And when God demanded that he take action against his sons, he wouldn't do it. And now he's become deaf to the whisper of God and blind to the things that God is doing. And that terrifies me. It terrifies me because God's Spirit whispers to me and to you, and if we ignore God, if we push God aside, if we know the message of God, but we continue to tune God out, there's going to come a day that I can no longer tune into him anymore. That I can't hear what God's whispering. And it's not that God quit whispering, it's just I can't hear it anymore. I can't see what God is doing anymore. And this is frightening in my mind. Throughout Scripture, we have seen this over and over again, especially in the Old Testament. We see people who followed God and did great things, but at the end of their life, they turned away from God. And so it seems like, with Eli. The message to Eli is not good news at all. I'm going to carry out all my threats against Eli and his family from beginning to end. I've warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever because his sons are blaspheming God and he hasn't disciplined them. So I have vowed that the sins of Eli and his sons will never be forgiven by sacrifices or offering. Now, back to our questions. Sometimes we ask questions of God and we don't like the answer God gives, right? Sometimes I am desperate for an answer and I ask the question, God, can you please help me understand? Help me, God, I'm asking this question. We don't like his answer. And so a lot of times when this happens, we seek God and the answer comes back, no. God, I'm asking you for physical healing. No. I mean, sometimes he says yes, but sometimes he says no. Lord, I prayed that you would open the door for that position, that job, and I've sought you and I've given my life to you. Please allow me to have that job. And the answer is no. Why? Or, God, I prayed for that scholarship and I can go to school if you give me that scholarship. And the answer came back, rejection, right? So what do we do when it seems like we're seeking an answer from God and the answer comes back, no? What do you do when sometimes it feels like you don't like the answer that God has given us? You know, throughout Scripture we see this also. Paul had healed a lot of people, physically healed them, driven out demons and all kinds of incredible things, much like Jesus did or all the other disciples. And then Paul had what he calls a thorn in his flesh. He has some physical condition that just won't go away. And he has asked God over and over again to heal him from this physical condition. But for some reason, God said no. Sometimes God says no. God knows the whole story, and we don't. Even Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays, if it is possible, and he's talking about going to the cross. He doesn't want to go to the cross as much as anybody would, but if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me, yet not my will, but your will be done. But often, we don't accept a no or an answer that God gives that we don't like. And so we go looking for somebody to give us an answer that we do like, right? We go looking for somebody who will tell us the answer we really are looking for instead. And so we go deeper into our echo chambers, looking for somebody who will just confirm what we think. or confirm our bias, whether it's true or not. They did the same thing in the ancient world. I think it was Dr. Phil, the great Dr. Phil. I think it was Dr. Phil who said, when you know the truth, you can handle almost anything. Now, whether you like Dr. Phil or not, I have no idea. But that's a true statement. When you know the truth, you can handle almost anything. Yet sometimes the truth is really, really hard to hear. So oftentimes, our unasked questions stunt our faith development. I'm afraid to ask that question. I'm afraid that it'll pull the thread and it'll all fall apart. I'm afraid that the answer will disappoint me. I'm afraid that it's going to go somewhere where I don't want to go. And so we work up the courage to ask the question, and the answer comes back and we dismiss it, and we go looking for somebody. That also stunts our faith development because we didn't take the answer that God was sending or giving us. And sometimes just asking the question out loud, maybe you don't even have the answer. Sometimes just asking the question allows you to move forward anyway. It's almost like baseball, right? You have to, if you're batting, you have to go to first base first, and then to second, and then to third, and then home, right? You don't just get to skip the whole thing or skip from one base to another. You have to go through the progression, and so it is with our questions. We sometimes we have to follow them through, but sometimes just asking the question, even without the answer, allows us to move forward because we had the courage to ask a question that was hard. Paul says we see through a looking glass darkly. Some of the answers we don't have this side of eternity. But I want to tell you, as we kick off this series, you can trust God with your questions. You can. Even Eli could trust God. What did God say? Even Eli could trust God with his questions. And I wish he would ask the next question. I wish Eli would have said, what should I do? God, what should I do? If my offerings and sacrifices won't bring about redemption for me, what should I do? I wish he would have asked. He didn't ask that question as far as we know. You can trust God with your questions. The Ark of the Covenant would then, here's the way this played out real quick. So the Philistines attacked Israel. There was a war, a battle. Israel lost. Then Israel decided, let's take out our secret weapon. Let's take the Ark of the Covenant out because we always win the battles when we have the Ark of the Covenant on the battlefield. And so the two sons of Eli took the Ark of the Covenant out to the battle. And the enemies of God were terrified because the Israelites were so excited and they cried out because they had their secret weapon on the field. But the Philistines won the battle. And they took the Ark of the Covenant, and they killed Eli's sons. And then, Eli is sitting on a stool by the road, listening for how the battle went, and he's worried. He's worried about the Ark of the Lord, because he's the priest. And a messenger comes running back and says, your sons were killed in the battle, and the Ark was captured. And Eli was shocked when he heard it, and he fell backward. His stool, he tipped over. And he fell and he broke his neck. Scripture tells us he was heavy. And he fell, he broke his neck. And if it would have ended there, that would have been tragic enough. But Phinehas, one of the priests, his wife was pregnant. And when she heard that her husband and Eli were both dead, she went into labor. And she died shortly after she gave birth. And as she, in her death throes, she named her child Ichabod, which means because the Lord's glory has departed Israel. Ichabod. Don't name your kid that. What do we do with our questions? What do we do? Get curious. Ask. Not all questions are equal. Some of our questions are probably not as important as others. But those ones that you come up against, and now you're kind of stopped. And I'm unable to really move forward now. I'm unable to follow Jesus because right here, this question has me blocked. Those are the kind of questions that we have to dig into. And you might not have the answer on this side of eternity, but ask anyway. So then my question for you is this: what unresolved questions do you have? What unresolved questions do you have? Does something pop to mind? Maybe you set up camp there at that spot and you're afraid to move forward from there. Let me tell you this: you can trust Jesus with your question. I'm not saying that Jim is a perfect question answerer by any means at all, but you can trust Jesus with your question. Ask the question that stumped you and stopped you. And maybe you've gotten an answer from God, but you don't like the answer you've gotten. Now the next question is, what should I do now, Lord? I don't like that answer, but what should I do now? So, we'll close with this. Jesus said, and I'm going to invite our band to make their way back up, but Jesus said about prayer. He was talking about when you're asking for something in prayer. This is in Matthew 7, verse 7. He said, keep on asking. And if you receive what you ask for, keep on seeking. Keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep knocking, and the door will be open for you. Everyone who asks receives. Everyone who seeks finds. And to everyone who knocks, the door will be open. You can trust. You can trust Jesus with your deepest questions. But we have to be willing to ask, to seek, and to knock. Would you stand as we sing?